No.
Yes.
That's not the game.
That's
Try it.
terrible.
No, just try
I'm
it.
not
That's-
participating in that.
That's
No,
not the game.
I'm
No.
serious.
Now you're trying to flip the script. That's
a
not
different
no.
game.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Irenicast. I'm your host, Jeff, and with me, as always, is my brother-in-law, Alan, and his cousin, Mona. We are post-evangelical ministers and theological thinkers grappling with our place in the progressive Christian world. Thank you for joining us for another conversation on faith and culture. This week, we are going to be talking about atonement. And honestly, I don't know how we've gone this long as three post-evangelicals not talking about this particular issue.
Well, I think it's first because we want to do it justice. And second of all, it's because every time I hear the word atonement, granted, I've studied theology for a very long time. Every time I hear the word, I just think of guys in cloaks singing, Omnus Deus Christis Morti.
And then hitting themselves in the face with a plank.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Monty
Atonement.
Python. Wonderful skit. Yes. Part of the reason we haven't talked about this is because it is kind of such a big deal, actually. Because we've come from a place where this is the defining question to a place where we're a little bit different and probably disagree between us three. And so it's been much more comfortable to talk about other stuff. And I've been really excited to speak about this. So,
Gosh, I hope we disagree.
I'm stoked.
Because actually we get feedback a lot that we don't disagree enough. And
Yeah.
so we're going to throw freaking down today.
throw down.
Throw it down.
All right. Well, before we throw down, let's define this. What do we mean by atonement? Because I think
Sure.
our guiding question is basically what we're saying is why did at all Jesus' death matter?
Yes.
Right? That's kind of what we're answering.
Yeah, this is an important conversation because Jesus' death on a cross, being crucified, is one of the two historically verifiable pieces of his life. All of the stuff that we have from the Bible, we really take on faith. I think that there are some historically verifiable stuff in there, but I would say everyone agrees that Jesus lived and that Jesus was crucified or executed. And the meaning of his execution determines all kinds of stuff. Like what you think about Jesus' death determines like what you think about God, what you think about yourself, or the Bible in general. And for billions of people on this planet, the cross and Jesus being executed is a central part of their worship experience or their look on the world. They put crosses on their churches, or they wear them, or they draw them. And this is just an important question. And so the idea that God was doing something in Jesus's death is the next step. I don't think anyone can argue with like whether it's an important question or not, but the question really is there a divine purpose for Jesus's death? Yes or no? And I would say from the very beginning, people have different answers. Some would say that there's only one, but there's a lot of answers to that question. So,
And there are a lot of people who would be on the no side, which, yes, I think is a definitively religious, faith-based answer, right? You could argue
yes.
that you're drawing any kind of mystical meaning from it. But on the no side, I think a lot of people who are on the yes side are like, well, you guys aren't religious, you guys aren't people of faith. But there's a lot of people who've been on the no side who still very much consider themselves religious and faith-filled and even mystical people. So that
or Christians.
There
are Christians who see divine purpose for lots of things that are happening in Jesus' life, or maybe his teachings, but to say that there is a divine purpose in the death of Jesus, you're right. Not everybody says that.
But they could still be people of faith. And so that's very important to note. Because I grew up with a lot of that. Like, well, if you don't believe Jesus' death did anything, then you are absolutely not a Christian. And actually, historically, that's not very accurate. With people who like self-identify as Christians, we could say, right?
Yeah. Well, there's always been the ins and outs, right? Heretics, Orthodox.
Heretics. Yeah.
I don't know if this is splitting hairs, but I think that there is a middle ground in the sense that it may be that it wasn't a divine purpose that Jesus died, but the divine purpose came from the death of Jesus.
Ooh, that's an important nuance, and that's something that people would tease out. Okay, so what does the word atonement mean? Let's start with that.
I kind of like where Jeff was going with that. That's just another option about. But before we tease it all out, the the idea that God is reacting in certain scenarios, like open theism or process theology, maybe probably more open theism. That's the idea that God is, in control and stuff, but God doesn't determine the future. In that kind of a construction, I could see Jesus's death being something God has used, but not something that God, had purpose for. I don't personally hold that there's no divine purpose in Jesus' death. I do think that there is, but I can see where that would go there. Anyway, so the atonement. Atonement is the theological term for righting wrongs, like reparation for a wrong or expiation for sin. Basically, the wrongdoing of a person, how that is undone. And especially in theological contexts, how humans are reconciled to God, because in Christian context there are things that people do that are not connected with God, whether you call it sin or something else, and how is that reconciled? And traditionally the death of Jesus is what reconciles people to God, and so therefore the atonement is the term that kind of talks about all of the significance of Jesus's death, whether someone holds to one definition or another. So,
well, before we move too far into it, I just want to make our listeners aware that we have talked about sin at length. So you can check that out in the show notes. We'll put a link to that episode because I think that really goes through. If we're talking about redeeming from something, we're talking about sin, and we've defined kind of where we stand with that. So I'll put that in the show notes,
which is different places. So
yes, very much so. Which probably won't be very different here either.
I've heard a lot of people define atonement as at-one-ment, which they always act like they are very clever, like they're the one to come up with that.
Yes, at one mint with God, being brought back together with God.
Well, okay, but my skeptical mind, the first thing I think of is why do we need to make wrongs right? That sounds really messed up. If somebody does something wrong, why don't we just call it for what it is?
You of all people.
Well,
you don't have to make amends for the things that you've done to
make it right. But you don't
to make it right.
Okay. But you don't make the wrong thing good. You make up for the wrong thing that you have done and make amends for it. But you don't make it weirdly good. And I say this for a very specific reason, is because some conceptions of atonement have been criticized as redemptive suffering. And this is a term that comes out of womanist theology, that make suffering somehow good, somehow something God wants from either Jesus or from us, that that atones through punishment, yeah. And horror. And I think that has come under heavy fire in the last few decades from certain groups of theologians who say that's incredibly destructive way to think about God, that God would ever want people to suffer for the greater good or for some kind of divine will, because God wants that from us, if that makes sense. So righting wrongs is complicated, right?
Yes. You just said, and in a roundabout way, you were actually talking about a very well-traversed path in Christian theology, I think. So there's, from the very beginning, like I said, a lot of different opinions, and throughout church history, one of the ones you just touched on was not making the bad thing good or whatever, but actually addressing it in a different way. And from the second century, with Irenaeus, there is an idea that Jesus's life itself is what is really the atonement, and the significance of his life and death are that he lived a life that was such a way, it was the way that God created human life to be. So he reverses disobedience with his obedience. He reverses dishonor with his honor, or he restores humanity to humans. He basically did it right. And so that's why he lived the way he did, and he was executed. But in all of that, he relives human life and restores it in a positive way. And that's been around for 1800 years.
Well, I would say that that's true, at least from some of the gospel writers. I would say that that's how they framed their gospel. Now, whether that was the actual intent of it, but you have that idea even replicated in the gospel's account of Jesus going to the wilderness after he was baptized. It follows this train of all the temptations that Satan presents before Jesus are representative of failures of Israel in the wilderness. So the way they even frame some of the stories in the gospel perpetuate that idea of that the old stories are being redeemed, and Jesus himself is doing it.
Like fulfillment of the law and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's made explicit in Paul when he talks about Jesus being the second Adam, right? Like Adam was was this shadow, that Jesus is the second person to relive Adam's life, and basically recapitulated is the term. But that's just one theory among many others about the significance of Jesus's death connected with his life. One of the oldest is the ransom theory, and that is that in Matthew chapter 20 and Mark chapter 10, there's a line where Jesus is talking about his death that is impending, and he says he will be a ransom for many. And the early church fathers and thinkers and theologians and mothers talked about what it meant for Jesus to be a ransom. And so they had the idea, many of them, that the ransom was paid to the devil. Did you guys ever watch the Chronicles of Narnia, or read the Chronicles of Narnia from C.S. Lewis?
Yeah.
Okay. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I love that book from when I was a little kid. There's a scene where the lion is tied to the altar, right? And the payment to the wicked queen, the White Witch. Sorry, thank you. The White Witch. The payment to her is the sacrifice, the blood, right? That's making a payment to the White Witch from, Aslan is giving himself up.
Because there's a debt that's owed.
Yeah. But he ends up tricking her at the darkest moment when all these like evil animals and spirits and stuff are flying around. There's a moment where he tricks her, where he comes back to life, and it's a trick of Aslan that he, fulfilled her requirement, but also rose on the third day, just like Jesus.
More of a loophole.
It's like a loophole.
So it's just like a transference of power. It's like there's a dominion of power that has authority, and then like the trickstery of Jesus, which there's been a lot written about Jesus as like a jester archetype, that's someone who like upends and reverses and uses comic, almost comedic puns to upend power structures, comes in and saves the day through these sort of tricks. So that's really interesting. But it really comes down to like a math equation, right? Like someone owes somebody something, somebody pays something else. So like it seems like this very simple like 1-to-1 ratio debt has been fulfilled, but then there's this excess, this remainder of something that allows for a new power structure to come into being. You can see that also in the idea of Jesus going into hell and taking the keys of death from Satan. So Satan thought he was defeating Jesus in the crucifixion, but then Jesus went down and actually stole death itself and the keys to death itself back from the devil, even in that defeat. So the defeat becomes victory.
Yeah, and it's not the only understanding in the Bible or in church history of Jesus. It's just one of the oldest. The concept of tricksterism, this is just an aside, goes way back in antiquity. Like, in the Hebrew Bible, you have Abraham and his sons being these tricksters who, because of their cunning, were able to upend injustice or avoid it or whatever. And so that's definitely a part of it. I think the thing that bothers me the most about the ransom, they call it the ransom theory of the atonement, is that God's making a payment to Satan. It's kind of suspect for me, right? That God would owe Satan anything to buy humans back, or that humans were under control of the control of Satan. Theologically doesn't sit with me very well, but it's definitely something that many traditions hold.
Here's the thing, though. If you really read the Bible, like really read it, there is so much suspect material in there about the relationship of God and kind of the devil, or a devil kind of figure. Like Job is a really good example of this, where God makes a wager with the devil that Job will turn his back, and so the devil is allowed to test Job to the limits of human experience. And even in that book, Job is asking God, like, why is this happening to me? And God comes back and says, who made the foundations of the earth? But then at the end of the book, it's kind of left ambiguous whether God actually has power to overcome the devil. Like that's kind of the weird theme of Job in all of that. So a lot of like modern philosophers and theologians have asked that question, like, does the story of the crucifixion actually reveal that God is actually not all powerful like we have thought since classical times.
Well, I think it's interesting you bring up Job, because when I think of the ransom theory, I think that's exactly what I think of, in the sense that in Job, it's a matter of what you've lost, you've gained back. So even down to Job's children. You've lost your children, but now you have new children, so everything's okay. And I think the ransom theory communicates the same thing. It's like, okay, as long as, these people suffered, blah, 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 but these people aren't, so now that makes everything okay. And I think it trivializes humanity.
Yeah, it kind of does. Like, don't worry about your grief for those old kids, because, hey, you got new shiny new kids. Everything's fine.
They're not iPads. I mean,
really
come on.
Yeah. You got a new wife.
I actually like Kurt Vonnegut is really influential for me for all of this. He was a atheist, humanist, but his whole point was like, you can't glorify human suffering because that glorifies something over and above raw humanity, and he saw raw humanity as like the good. And I think it was him who said being robbed of our suffering is like one of the big problems with religion or society, that we take people's suffering and just ignore it or whatever. The thing about the ransom theory and Job and Satan that I guess would bother me more is that even reading Satan back in, this should be said, reading Satan back into the Job story is kind of an anachronism, because in Job, it's just the adversary. It's not the fully developed, informed Satan that we have, today. It's this person, this being who is at God's beck and call, who's being, sent by God or whatever. And I guess there might be some back and forth there, but the whole conversation of Satan itself should happen at some point, because people disagree about exactly what that looks like, where Satan shows up in the Bible, whether Satan exists. And I know that we've had that conversation before, at least Jeff and I.
I just have to say a quick word to that, and then we can keep talking about atonement. But it's so much more theologically problematic to have an adversary within God, like a hidden evil God, kind of a figure, than to externalize Satan and to make him completely oppositional to God. Although you have to say, if God made all things, then God could also make Satan. So that's a can of worms I just opened up for everybody's
feel like we're building blocks towards our Halloween episode, talking about Satan, right? Yeah. We should do it.
Okay, let me bring it back to grace, though, because if we're righting wrongs, to me that harkens back to a lot of theologies of grace, and I wonder if that's why atonement kind of came to be, because we're trying to understand what it means for grace to even exist, and the space between our insufficiencies and God's awesomeness, and how to bring those two together and have an intimacy that can exist between utter finitude and what a lot of people would call lack, and maybe even evil or sinfulness, and God's beauty and perfection in some renderings of theology, right? So how do you bring those two together? Because, a lot of Old Testament materials dealing with this idea that God cannot coexist with imperfection and unholiness and dirtiness, So
it's interesting you say dirtiness, because I've read before that some of the earliest religious impulses some psychologists have tied with the desire to be clean. And if you look at like the Old Testament law and other stuff from other religions, the Hebrew Bible law and other religions, you will see that the desire to be clean is right next to godliness. Cleanliness is next to godliness, and that's what evolves into concepts of sin and of wrong and things like that. That's
I totally agree.
Thought, but
I totally agree. And I think there's
at the same time, there's like killing people and other stuff. So it's not, I guess, just trying to be clean from what you've done, but I would say that there is wrong in the world. It just doesn't have an existential reality. And this is like the underpinning of the whole conversation is, does sin have this like existential reality that you own, that you have to be like, it has to be taken away from you, or is it something else,
That's a good point. Is cleanliness like having something removed, having dirt removed off of you? Or is it something like having something added to you that absolves you? Or
I think the problem with atonement in general is that the problem is if any one person is taking one model or one mode or one metaphor of atonement and applying it to this is what it is. Because I think all of these speak to an element of something that is, I think at its core, mysterious. And I know that has a tendency to be a cop-out, and you can make it so. But I think for something as big as this and something as central as this, I think there's an element of ransom, because it's something that, at least during the biblical writers' era, that was a little bit more tangible. For us, it's a little bit less personal, but I don't think that there's anything wrong with us beginning to come up with new modes for atonement, to begin to speak about what we believe when it comes to this idea of grace or forgiveness or whatever we're attaching to that.
So you just foreshadowed the way that I'm going to go at the very end of this conversation, and that's that there was so many views represented at the beginning, and it's incumbent upon us to honor the fact that there are multiple ways of interpreting Jesus' death, and we have different metaphors, and to have one controlling metaphor above all others actually does a disservice to the Bible, itself. You mentioned that the atonement's a mystery, and that's actually probably the most important metaphor of all. The early church was grappling with the mystery itself. I mean, Jesus shows up on the road to Emmaus, and there's these two people talking about his death, and they don't understand it, and other people don't understand it, and it's something that develops over time. Like, what does this mean for the people who are following Jesus, and for Christians who believe that there's some sort of operation here that's going on? And Paul talks about it being a mystery, and the early church fathers talk about being a mystery, or even something shameful in the eyes of the rest of the world. Like, they have to explain, Jesus died, was crucified, or the followers of this very wise sage, or this very powerful overcomer or Messiah. And you could read the whole gospel, many of the gospel accounts, as explaining the shame of the end of Jesus' ministry. Explaining why the Messiah had to suffer is like the whole purpose of Mark and other parts of the gospel. That this mystery has a point is like the metaphor for a lot of the writers. But where you go from there, like we said, ends up in ransom or recapitulation or
redemptive suffering.
So here's a few more. Christus Victor is also a really old way to look at the atonement, and that's that Jesus overcame evil and death in going to the cross. He actually showed real power, and that he's freeing humanity from slavery to whether it's, evil or evil powers on the earth or Rome or whatever you want to say. He comes out the victor, and he wins over humanity by his actions. And so that's very different than thinking about what we've kind of mentioned before, and that's the substitution theory, the penal substitution theory, like the justice. Christus Victor's like, Jesus overcame, not Jesus was punished by God so that people would be forgiven. So that they're different.
Part of the problem that we have also is that the only language that the gospel writers especially had was Jewish language of the sacrificial system. So even if they were, like, we're talking about this idea of mystery and how they're not sure. If you're not sure about something, the only thing you can do to describe it is use language that you know and try to nuance it and use it in a way to explain something you're not yet sure about. And I think that's a big hang-up for me growing up when it came to all this, is because it was about the blood and the sacrifice, and it was all this mode of how to appease God, and then also trying to use that very language of like God needs appeasing and sacrifice, and then apply it to this thing that's so different in the other way that we communicate it, with grace and love and acceptance. And to me, it was using almost opposite terms to describe something.
Yeah, that God's loving and that God needs to punish sin feels like an opposite.
So, Alan, you talked about the C.S. Lewis example earlier about appeasing like an adversary or a devil or a white witch character like in C.S. Lewis, but there's a whole strain. And I think what I've been exposed to most in atonement theology is what's called satisfaction theory, that's attributed to St. Anselm. It's like God is wrathfully angry about evil in the world, like pissed off. And the only way to appease, like you said the word, Jeff, to appease God is to offer the ultimate sacrifice in Christ, right? And it's
blood
interesting.
Sacrifice.
Yeah, the ultimate, like the sacrifice of sacrifices, where Christ took on all the sin of the world. This is probably starting to sound very familiar if you grew up in like Calvinist or neo-Calvinist evangelical or Baptist circles. That Jesus took on the wrath of sin and all the evil and all the guilt and shame of the world and took it into hell and left it there. That's kind of the typical theology that you might hear.
Jesus was infinite, he could take on infinite sins, and that's why that mattered instead of the other sacrifices of the Hebrew Bible.
And that's why God had to forsake him, because God had to turn away from all of the evil that Jesus took on the cross, thus accounting for the final moments of Christ. So I have to say that it's interesting that people have come up with like really incredible viewpoints on this narrative of the simple crucifixion of Jesus to like tease out so many layers of meaning. So I mean, but to me, it's interesting that the satisfaction theory in Anselm, so Anselm was in like the Middle Ages guy. So Anselm had this idea of satisfaction, that God's wrath needed to be satisfied, that there was this incredibly angry part of God. Abelard came after him pretty soon after and said, no, Jesus' death was an outcome of his utter life of love and peace. And therefore, Jesus, we call this the Abelardian theory, the exemplar model, or the model of love, that Jesus' life actually mattered more than Jesus' death. Jesus' death was a death of a martyr because he lived a life that was so freaking radical that the powers that be couldn't even handle and had to end him. And that was the crux of the meaning. But, and this is my cynical reading of historical power analysis, that Anselm's theory of substitutionary atonement actually benefited institutional hierarchical religion a lot more, because if you have a simple math equation, you can require that people jump through a lot of hoops to fit into that, versus just saying we ought to love each other radically and be radically hospitable. So that's a really interesting narrative to read up on. But I think it
why
goes to
one
show,
survived and why another didn't.
Yeah, sort of Abelard got buried in history. He totally got buried.
He did, for a lot of other reasons too. But you're right. He had some very unique insights. I think he was at Notre Dame way back in. It's weird to think he was preaching and teaching at a university back in 1100s. It's nuts.
In France, though, not in.
Yes. I believe
okay.
So.
I could be totally wrong. Then. Yeah. Notre Dame, not Notre Dame.
The thing about you said satisfaction at one point and substitution at another, but that actually illustrates what I was going to say, is that Anselm's satisfaction theory is what laid all of the groundwork for what came later.
It's easy to confuse them.
Yeah, well, no, they're basically the same thing. You said the people tease out the meanings and make it really specific. Well, when the reformers came along in the 16th century, they took the thoughts that started with Anselm and they teased it out further. Not only is God angry at sin and God needs to be satisfied, the justice of God has to be satisfied in the sense that blood has to be spilt to actually forgive the sin. And so the substitutionary atonement plays off of satisfaction. And then even further, we're like narrow. It's like a V, right? You're narrowing in to something called penal substitution. And that's like under the law. And you probably heard this before, the Romans Road. You've broken the law. God can't stand people, the law being broken, and must out of his justice be it. I say his because normally that's how you say it. His justice, you kill the person because they broke the law. So to take your place on the cross to satisfy the justice aspect of God, Jesus was killed so that his justice was satisfied. That's the version that got solidified in the Reformation and has gone today to be such an important part of American Christianity and a lot of evangelicalism, is that God just can't forgive. What it comes down to is God cannot look at sin and just forgive it. There has to be a blood sacrifice.
I think there's another layer there, though.
Interesting. It's interesting because isn't that exactly what Jesus does in the gospel? Like when you look at it over and over, you see Jesus telling people, you're forgiven. Like
right, yeah,
without blood
go
being
and sin no more. Yeah,
and you actually wonder,
no, you're right. You're absolutely right. Before he died.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, before we move on real quick, I just want to remind the listeners that we're throwing out a lot of theological terms, and anytime we do that, you can check our show notes. For this episode, it's irenicast.com/59, and we will have links to these terms so you can kind of expand on what they mean if you have a question about that. Because I think sometimes we forget that we have those resources available, and we want to make sure that no one gets completely lost in this conversation.
If
like
anything, if anything piques your interest, there's usually a link in the episode on the website. You can just rabbit trail to all sorts of interesting stuff. So
and write to us because we get so excited when people write to us. We honestly do. But I was on top of what you said, the point about justice is being maybe very an American focus in particular. After post-Enlightenment with the work of Locke and whatever. What is really important to keep in mind is that for centuries and centuries, Christianity, in order to make itself a valid religion, not today because it's politically offensive, but for a very long time, was hell-bent on proving that Christianity was the fulfillment and the replacement for Judaism. The word is called supersessionism. And so you have to consider that a lot of these theologies developed in this political milieu that was very anti-Semitic, and it was very focused on the Jewish law and replacing or fulfilling the Jewish law in particular. And so when you're reading these ideas of atonement and requirements of blood sacrifice and things like that, and how it all relates, to the temple and all these things. Keep in mind that Christians for a long time had a very antagonistic relationship to Judaism, and that influenced their theologies. I
and that's
cannot
kind of an
understate
unfortunate heritage of Protestantism, especially. And
it's super ironic.
That's good to be said.
If you dig even deeper into that, and I feel like I can't let it go without doing this. If you read the passages in the New Testament that talk about the law not being the program of God or the program of Jesus, or there's some, grace versus law like butts up against each other, it actually undoes the idea of the very atonement model that those people, reformers and others, have espoused.
What do you
mean? What I mean is, if you look at Hebrews, and there's a really good breakdown of this. Benjamin L. Corey is this missiologist and theologian who works a lot with like progressive Christianity, and he's actually going to be coming on the show in the coming weeks. Yeah, super excited about it.
Next week we will have him on the show.
Yeah, and on him, I'm going to ask him about his series on atonement because he's put one up on his blog, and he has a lot of people interacting who come from evangelical backgrounds. But he makes the point in one of these. It's a post called "Blood Sacrifices." Blood sacrifices, but God didn't even like blood sacrifices. And he points out that in Hebrews, which is a very popular place to go when you want to talk about Jesus being the sacrifice that satisfies stuff, it actually explicitly says that blood sacrifice itself never worked. It never had the power to take away sins. It was only for us and our consciences and not for God. And then goes on to say, quoting Jesus, that these were done according to the law, even though God did not delight in them. So if you're going to go the route of the New Testament and criticize law, like in Hebrews and in other places, it actually totally undoes the idea of sacrifice itself. So it's funny if they would just read a little deeper and we would dig a little deeper into the things that we think support our position, or it's just funny that historically that, yes, you're right, there was anti-Semitism that propped up the ideas that people preached, but in the middle of that, it undoes substitutionary atonement, right? Because
why do we need a payment? Why do we need a payment?
Yeah.
Is the question.
So that's...
well, going back to what you were saying, Alan, like a couple minutes ago, the idea of that God just can't forgive, that's stupid.
No, that's the central focus.
All right, so we're coming to the end of this conversation. I think we can easily go round and round about this particular one. So let's finish with you personally answering the question: what does Jesus' death mean?
I once thought that Jesus' death was a sacrifice and did substitute for me on the cross, and I didn't think about things like in Psalm 51. Where God is we're speaking about God and saying you don't delight in sacrifices. And in Hosea, you'd rather have mercy, not sacrifice, rather than burnt offerings. The whole program of reading the Bible for me was all about there's this transaction that's going to happen. And so everything's either a foreshadow or an explanation of that transaction. And the whole point of existence is to have my sin forgiven by Jesus dying on the cross. Now, when I preach on Palm Sunday or I preach on Passion during the Passion Week and I talk about Jesus' death and I think about it, it's more of you could probably call it a Christus Victor model, but the idea that God assumed human violence and radically transformed it. That Jesus took his preaching throughout his life, Matthew 5, and other places, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, respond to hate with love, overcome evil with good. I do believe the death of Jesus was not a shameful ending of his program, but actually the culmination of it. Because in that, God responds to human violence by doing something good. By laying down his life as a ransom doesn't mean he's taking on all the sins of everybody, but he's paying the payment that we require. We require blood. Rome required blood. And Jesus was like, I will show you what I mean, that I mean what I say, and that God means what I say. And so going all the way is transforming our violence and hate and evil, not transforming the violence and hate and evil of God, if that makes any sense. And so I don't know if that
was awesome.
Makes sense or anything, but that's how I feel. And yeah, it's not a payment to the devil, And I think it's really important in all of this conversation. For me personally, as a Christian, I do believe that there was a divine purpose in Jesus's death. That's just me personally. I do believe it was a reality, a historical event. You can't just take this and make it mean anything, right? It's has historical context. It happened in Judea in the first century. And I think that we have, just by virtue of the Bible we have a mandate. This is really what Joel B. Green talked about in the book, The Four Views on the Atonement. We do have a mandate to embrace the kaleidoscope of the meanings of the atonement. To push one above all others and invalidate all the others is to really invalidate the Bible that we've been given and the tradition we've been given. So that's where I'm at.
So what's the personal meaning, though, for you, the faith-filled meaning?
Besides
the one that I articulated,
transforming our violence, our violence.
Okay.
I think that the only way to God could have responded to human violence and evil, which I do believe happens. It's not something existential that you can touch, right? But it's something that we do, and I believe God addressed that and transformed it in the death of Jesus. The oppressive system of Rome and all those things were shown for what they were. They were unmasked. They were brought down from their positions of power and shown for what they were in the killing of Jesus. And so I think that something happens there. It's not just an accident. There is a divine purpose, but that's the side I err on.
That was good. I like that, Alan. And I'm going to say something similar, I suppose, which surprises me because you and I disagree a lot, but apparently
well, hey, I've changed, okay? We were going to disagree on this at one point.
We all evolved, right?
A couple years ago, maybe, it would have been different.
Nobody has to have the answers. I certainly don't. But recently, I heard a story of a woman who was at the final march before the Berlin Wall fell on the East Germany side. So the Berlin Wall, as we all know, is this incredible symbol of oppression and evil. And this account was that speaking to the guards after the fact, a lot of people remember the Berlin Wall coming down kind of like by force, and Mr. Gorbachev tearing on this wall and the political pundits. But what actually happened, according to this woman's account, was that the people of East Berlin and West Berlin at the same time marched on the wall with their children and with candles and with prayers. I'm going to tear up just thinking about this because according to the guards, they expected grenades and cannons and force, but they did not anticipate peace and prayers. And for me, that symbolizes the death of Christ, like a lamb to the slaughter, not a sacrificial lamb, but someone who comes in the most vulnerable state to expose radical evil for what it is through that utter that utter presentation of peace. It's not a guise at all. It's the opposite of a guise. It's utter exposure. It's intimacy. And so for me, the death of Christ is meaningless in a sense of I don't think that there was some like mystical exchange with the devil. But what I do think is that it was an outcome of a life lived in the most utter peace, and peace that was so complete and so wholehearted that it actually takes on powerful transcendent qualities, divine qualities, and breaks the divine into the world. So I do think it was like meaningful in its meaninglessness, that we can't make sense of senseless violence. It just is. It just violence and suffering just is. It's not sensible. But in that, evil can be exposed, and we can actually break out of cycles of that violence that will destroy us. And so for me, that really is what the hope of the gospel comes down to.
It's so interesting how we usually we've been lately ending up in the same place from different routes. It's just interesting.
What about Jeff?
I love that. What if I haven't ended up in the same place?
Well, you know what? You're right. I'm speaking too quickly. I just want to say, like, I appreciate everything you just said, and I feel like I could sign my name to that. That's awesome. And Jeff is gonna be even better, right? You're gonna blow me away with what you've got.
That's too much pressure, man.
No. I was going to say,
Calm
holy
your jets.
freaking crap, I agree. And
Right?
that's kind of where I land. But in the sense that I think that all interpretations of the atonement are valid because it's the language people had. And I think where we are in our culture, I think the reason that we are all landing with this, maybe the power of the atonement is the fact that it reflects the best of the people in that era. Because when I think of why did Jesus have to die, I think of Selma. I think of sometimes, not even sometimes, I would say that if you are on the front lines of a non-violent but very aggressive, because I think sometimes we associate nonviolence, and we've talked about this before, we associate nonviolence with weakness, but I think there's an aggressiveness in that nonviolence, and that aggressiveness will eventually cause violence to be taken upon you. And that the real strength and power is like Mona, what you've been saying, and Alan, what you've been saying, is when that needless violence is put on display for other people to stop and pause and be like, wait a minute, maybe we need to rethink this whole thing. And I think that that's the power of the cross, and I think that's the legacy of the cross, is people rejecting violence because I don't know. I think I already said what I was going to say.
Rejecting violence as opposed to glorifying it and saying it's necessary.
But sometimes rejecting it by being a victim. Not that it's necessary, but that it may be inevitable if we're talking about sin systems, if we want to use that word.
That's really interesting.
To overcome it. It, not just resist it, but to like offer something beyond.
Because I think we have a tendency, a third way. I think in our brain we have a tendency, if we're disconnected from something, it's easy for us to throw it. Like when I look at my Facebook feed sometimes, it is amazing to me how some people are so quick to be like, if someone comes into my house, I'm going to shoot them, because they're so disconnected from the actual violence. However, I think if they actually had experience and saw that violence, it would be a lot more transforming for them towards nonviolence than anything else. And I think that's what the cross does.
I think someone can hear what you just said, especially at the very beginning, Jeff, when you said, you just like nailed something that I wanted to say at some point, and I do feel very deeply, not to the cross. Wow, that's a really unfortunate.
Someone had to make a joke at some point.
You said that the different metaphors and the different understandings of Jesus' death reflect the people. Unless you think that that's just a very subjective definition of Jesus and it's just going with the culture or whatever, that actually happened from the beginning. And if you look at the Bible and you read the different texts in the Bible, not like it's all one thing, but these are actually different voices. And instead of taking the understanding from one and shoving it into the other, when you read through it, you will see different understandings of Jesus' death. And if you do get really interested, read the book by Joel B. Green, is one of the people who put it together, The 4 Views on the Atonement. That's his point at the end, is that it was a historical event, but it has different meaning for different people, and that's how it's been from the very beginning. And that's how it should be.
I would also recommend, just to throw a book title out there, is that these conversations, believe it or not, are actually happening in evangelical circles, maybe not American evangelical circles, but I would recommend a book called The Atonement Debate, and it basically describes the Evangelical Alliance in the UK starting to have these conversations as a result of a book written by a guy named Chalk and another guy by named Mann called The Lost Message of Jesus, where it's evangelicals challenging the idea of specifically penal substitution, that it's basically a divine form of child abuse. So I would encourage you to check that out as well.
Man, we didn't even jump into the end of these things. We talked about kind of why, how they came up, how we feel about them, but like this is maybe a conversation for a different time, but what does all of this lead us to actually do in our lives and the way we look at God or look at ourselves?
Well, that's our soteriology episode. I want to recommend some reading too. Martin Luther King's work on Jesus. I mean, people forget his memory is very sanitized and whitewashed in a very real sense, but people forget that he was very much a theologian. But his work on Jesus' death and civil action is really incredible. So I recommend reading up on him, on his work in particular.
Probably the most influential work for me as far as moving away from what we've talked about.
And James Cone, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, is another one. It's very good.
Yeah, it's very good. All right, well, let us know what you think. If you have anything to add to this specific conversation, or again, you want just the terms, you can check that out at Irenicast.com/59. That's Irenicast.com/59. And then, as usual, and we don't really just say this to say it, but anytime you have suggestions for the show, whether it's questions, comments, or concerns, we are always welcome to hear from you at Irenicast.com/feedback. We were having a conversation before this conversation about how people have told us that in the show we say something interesting and then we move past it. We want to know what's interesting to you. So give us that information so that we can form an episode or a part of an episode around those issues. So with all that being said, on the other side of the music, we are going to be bringing back our segment called Sorta Scattergories.
Pie Jesu Domine, dona eis requiem. Pie Jesu Domine, dona eis requiem.
Sort of Scattergories. This is actually the third time we're going to be playing this game. We did it in episode 16 and episode 45. And how this is going to work is that each of us has a category, and then we will attach a letter to that category. And the other two hosts have to go back and forth, coming up with an answer until one of them can no longer do so.
Yes, and I feel
Just
like
Scattergories.
I have to mention this again. I mentioned it in episode 16. This game.
No, you mentioned it in every episode so far. Just so you know,
because it makes me angry. It brings out the devil in me. No other game on the planet will do this.
Okay,
you could slap me in the face.
For our avid
totally
listeners,
fine.
I promise we do not have a script for this
We
thing. Because
don't.
Alan, you've said, like, I even acknowledged that the last time we did this game is that you've said that.
I have to say it. It's my grand caveat for Scattergories or sort of Scattergories.
You talk big, man, but I have yet to see the devil, and I've been waiting to see the devil in you. And last time you were like, I'm gonna get all competitive, but you were like mildly more competitive than normal. So I'm waiting for you to bring it.
Because people sin against I love categories. I love things being, isms and stuff like that. And when someone says something is in a category when it isn't, and everybody's nodding their heads, it drives me nuts.
I love categories. First of all, yeah,
and feelings at the same time. Anyway,
all right. Who is first?
I'll go first.
Okay.
Wait, I said that, but I actually don't have an idea yet. So someone else go first. I just wanted to go. I just wanted to volunteer.
Ready?
Alan, why don't you go first? You were super prepared for this episode, right?
Super prepared.
Because I'm really angry with this, I wanted to make sure that I got it straight before starting. So I actually have two options. One's like the normal sort of Scattergories, and one's like the sort of Scattergories that I'm really excited about. So
I don't know what that means, but let's continue.
It means this. Instead of giving me, usually you'd say like a medication that starts with A or something like that, and you guys go back and forth. I am going to change things up even further because I hate this game and love it at the same time. You have to come up with a phrase, an idiom, like a phrase that has special meaning, containing the word apple.
No.
Yes.
That's not the game.
That's
try
terrible.
it. No, just try
I'm not
it.
participating in that.
That's not the game.
I'm serious.
Now you're trying to flip the script. That's not
greatest.
Game.
It's the greatest thing ever. Just try it.
Then you play
what's
it.
an idiom with the word
we
apple?
can make that a whole
yourself.
separate game, but that's not how we prepare for this game.
gosh.
It's not how we prepared.
That's not right.
Like
that's messed up.
an apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
You have two non-participants playing your invisible game.
You can't.
Okay. All right, so here you go. Here's my other one.
All right, then we forfeit your turn, Alan.
You had
Yeah,
a plan
no.
because you
Here we
know
go.
we wouldn't go along
You tell
with
me.
it.
I'm caught. Yes. Okay, I didn't want to go first because I wanted to sneak this in.
Totally
it's so
called you
fun.
out.
My wife and I in the car do this. I make her play all the time. I say, what's an idiom that starts with the letter C? And then we go, all that in a bag of, or with the word chips, all that in a bag of chips, chip off the old block, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, my thing is this: alcoholic beverages that start with the letter B. And this can be any
B as in boy?
Alcoholic company. Yeah, B as in
Okay.
boy. Any
Budweiser!
alcoholic company, any any type of alcoholic drink or mixed drink. So there you go. You got Budweiser.
Is that okay? So brands count.
Yeah, and basically I'm trying to find out which one of you is not, the Irenicast
Oh,
alcoholic.
I see. This is a alcohol witch hunt. Thank you for that.
Okay, well, okay. So if I say beer,
I guess that's fine. But the specific stuff that's fine, dude. Whatever you want. Yeah, beer works.
all right, beer. That's all I drink.
And mixed
Bacardi.
stuff. Ooh.
Bailey's.
Buttery nipple is a drink
Hey,
that
that's
you can
actually
order.
yeah. Hey, the guy who does our music on our intro that's listed, Mike, he actually taught me what a buttery nipple was, and that sounds really weird saying it out loud. Right.
The drink or something else? Because I'm pretty sure it's referenced to
Drink.
something else.
You're supposed to order that at the end of the night. It's nice. It's
Okay.
soothing. Yeah.
I'm sure
Wait,
it
was
is.
it
Like, I
supposed to
don't
be
know.
family friendly? I don't.
It's an actual
We
name
just-
of a drink?
It is.
I don't know.
Come on, Barfly Jeff. You got this.
Okay. I don't know if this is real, but I'm just guessing because I've heard that it has other flavors. But butterscotch schnapps.
Okay.
Does that
Yeah,
exist?
that's a thing.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right.
That's actually,
I guess.
I think that's actually in a buttery nipple. Just so you know,
Oh,
That's
nice.
amazing.
There's a cider company that I love called Bantam Cider.
Oh, well, okay.
Never heard of that.
We can play that.
Oh, there you
route.
go. Yeah, dude,
really-
you know
it's
all
really
this
a
like
promise.
craft brews and stuff, Jeff. You know all these beers everywhere.
Yeah. So, okay, so you can do companies. Well, I'm going to say Bear Republic.
Bordeaux.
Bomb, comma, Irish car.
No.
No,
No.
no. I'm gonna take the win away from you for that. No.
I don't know. I'm done.
Okay.
Okay.
The winner of most alcoholic drinks named Mona.
This is a hollow victory. I'm not sure why.
It is. That was my whole. That was. My
That's
whole
because you had to
program.
listen to Alan say buttery nipple.
More than once. Yeah, I think.
I did, didn't I? Yeah, that's a great drink, though.
Buttery
It really is.
nipple. What's in it, actually?
Butterscotch and Bailey's or something. I'm pretty sure it's like
That's
or
nasty.
Kahlua or
Just
something.
like candy.
It's like candy. It's like a Werther's Original.
It's like if you candied a nipple.
Mona, are you ready?
Why don't you go next, Jeff?
Okay. All right, so my category is things you would find in a junk drawer.
Oh, dang.
And my
And
letter
this is a regular junk drawer, Mona. Not.
Yeah.
Not Mona's
I'm
junk
already- I'm
drawer.
already
You can't say
You
like
guys don't even want
I'm
to
already
know it's in my
upset.
junk drawer.
yeah, last time one of the categories was like family games, and you were just saying like random things that no one in the world plays except
You're
for
like
apparently your
hop on
family.
your left
I have
foot.
no
Like,
recollection
that
of
doesn't-
Okay. So things you find in a junk drawer and the letter is S.
Scissors,
Okay?
Scotch tape.
Okay?
screwdriver,
Screws. Haha.
Okay.
Does a stylus work?
Yeah.
What's this-
Because there's like lots of stylus. I have styluses. Stylus
in your junk drawer?
Yeah, I do.
Really?
Jeff says yes. He's the sole arbiter.
Actually, I just
That's how it
found an
works.
old stylus in my junk drawer, so
Ooh.
that totally works.
Scrap paper.
Mine will be stamps.
Sizable markers. The big kind. Fat kind.
Are you saying Sharpie markers?
Yeah, Sharpie markers.
No, she didn't say sharper. She
I
said,
said Sharpie.
sizable, as
no, I
in
said
like
Sharpie,
large.
actually.
No,
I think that's what she meant.
She said, don't
I
help
meant
her out.
Sharpie.
See, you guys are doing this to make me angry. I knew it would happen. You can't say sizable.
So far, this is the longest round
like,
we've ever had. Like, it's gone back and forth. I don't want to ruin the momentum, so I took it as Sharpie.
You
so,
could
Alan,
say sizable markers could be like, I don't know.
Any kind
of color that starts with S.
Bigger than normal size.
Oh, a small marker. That's mine. I mean, like, it's the exact same thing.
I'm going to say a skinny marker.
Can I say a sketchy marker that looks weird? I mean,
no pun intended. Is it the
more
pun is
intended? Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Clean slate.
I'm going to go with a stapler.
And she has to go.
Stapler. Okay, good.
There you go.
Stapler. That's good.
Stapler.
Staples.
Oh.
You bastard.
Sneaky.
I'm done. It's 11:52 here p.m.
Spools.
and my brain is shutting off.
There you go. That's the latest we've ever recorded, right?
Yeah, this is not our normal recording time.
I would say spools of something.
Spools? What are you in the 1850s?
You already
String.
won. You couldn't come up with
starting your own
spools
socks?
of string, storage lids,
dang it.
like little storage
All right,
containers.
Alan, you are the winner. Mona, do you have one?
Fine.
I know junk, you guys.
Apparently, you got your. I know alcohol. You know junk.
Yeah.
Let's see what Jeff knows.
Let's see what Jeff knows. What is it, Mona?
Okay, we're gonna go with global corporations that start with the letter D.
Fictional or real ones?
What fictional? What you could just make up anything. Of course, real.
Delta, the airline.
Okay.
Because that's like global, right? They fly to other places. I don't know anything
super
about
global.
Yeah,
I
I don't know if Delta's a corporation.
It has to be.
Yeah, it's definitely a corporation.
Delta.
We'll say companies. We'll say companies because we're going to argue about the corporations.
Global companies, though, right?
Global companies. Global companies start with the letter D.
Dunkin' Donuts.
Is it global though?
That's going to be every answer. Is it global though?
Dang it. Okay,
Is it
we'll
global?
just say
Dutch
okay.
Bros. Is it global though?
Revision. Large companies that
Thank
start with
you.
the letter D. Okay, thank you. All right.
Dutch
Sizable
Brothers.
companies.
This is going to take forever.
Is it?
Let's try it. Well,
Okay.
actually, I don't know very
Quick.
many companies, so actually that won't happen. It won't take very long.
You're such a humanitarian.
No. I'm
Okay, what?
Are you
What'd
gonna go?
say,
even
Alan?
uninformed. I said Dutch Brothers, the coffee.
Okay.
All right. There's going to be a theme in mind. Del Taco.
Me too. Domino's. See, this is not good. This is not good. Not good at all. You should do restaurant. You should do fast food chains. That would be enough.
Dave and Buster's.
That doesn't even remotely count. I was going to say Denny's, and that counts as fast food more than David Buster's, dude.
No, we're not doing fast food.
Oh, okay. Denny's.
That was your idea.
Stupid.
You can just assign
I feel like we're
You feel
degrading.
You can't just change
See-
the game.
Hey, no, see, once you give up on the atonement, you just go into all the vices. That's it. Alcohol,
All the vices.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. All the possible
hoarding,
venues for sin.
like junk. Yeah, a bunch of
sin.
restaurants.
So you said Denny's?
Denny's.
I don't know. I was going to make something up and be emphatic that it was real, but I don't have the energy.
I can't think of any others. Oh, Dickies. Yay! Is that a restaurant?
This game
Does that
is
count?
really dumb.
Yeah, it's a restaurant. All right. Well, this is
I know food and I know junk, and I
It's
feel
a
bad about
clothing
myself.
company.
So
Dickies clothing.
it's sporting
Oh yeah,
goods and
it's also a barbecue
restaurant.
place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, that'll do it for us this week. If you enjoy what you hear and you want to support the show, you can rate, review, and subscribe on your preferred listening platform. If you've already done that, you can go to irenicast.com/support for even more ways to show your love for the show. So for this week, I'm Jeff.
I'm Mona.
And I am Alan.
Thanks for joining the conversation. Man, that one. It's a good thing I have a few days to edit that one.
Segment, yeah. Of all time. I feel like I did.
It'll be fun.
All right, everyone hit stop.